If you watched my last video, you might remember that I've been experimenting with two radically different programs to see if my cochlear implant can do away with the munchkin voices that I've experienced since my activation almost 5 months ago. About every 10 days or so, I've been switching off between my standard map and my experimental map. The results are not what I expected. I like both of them for different reasons. One sounds better, and the other kind of works better. Which would you choose? Should I just pick one map, stick with it, and let my brain adapt to it? Or should I run one more experiment in the hopes of having the best of all worlds? I know, stupid question. I mean, you know I'm going to do the experiment, right? Hi, I'm Vince. Before we begin, I want to refresh your memory about my current experiment, and then I'll explain what I want to do next and why. Here's a little lingo to get familiar with to help it all hopefully make a little more sense. Tonotopic organization, place coding, and temporal coding. These terms all have to do with how our brains and ears work together to determine pitch. Tonotopic organization refers to how the physical layout of our inner ear, auditory nerve, and brain are organized to distinguish between low tones and high tones. If you think of your ear as a rolled-up keyboard, the end with the low notes is in the deepest part of your cochlea, and the side with the high notes is in the outermost part of your cochlea. Your ear brain uses two different methods to, well, probably more than that, but two primary methods to determine what frequency is arriving at your ear and telling you, for instance, what note is being played. The first method is kind of the most obvious, and it's called place coding. When the little hair cells in a healthy cochlea hear, say, 440 Hertz middle A on a full-size keyboard, there's a specific place along your auditory nerve that is more or less tuned to hear that specific frequency. The hair cells resonate at that frequency, and they stimulate the auditory nerve at that specific place, and your auditory nerve tells your brain with absolute certainty, yep, that's 440 Hertz. But if you have a cochlear implant, those hair cells at that specific location are probably a distant memory. Instead, you now have 16 electrodes, well, in the case of Advanced Bionics anyway, and you'd better hope that the one that is trying to send you the signal for 440 Hertz is pretty darn close to the specific place along your auditory nerve that is primed and ready to hear that frequency. And therein lies the problem. While everyone's tonotopic organization is roughly the same, with the low frequencies deep in your cochlea and the higher frequencies on the outside, everyone's cochlea is a little bit different. Maybe even as different as fingerprints. Some are larger, some are smaller, some are still growing, and the precise location of each person's sensitivity to any given frequency is likely to vary at least a little bit from person to person. But instead of all those specific frequencies being stimulated by thousands of vibrating hair cells, in my case, they're all being stimulated by a one-size-fits-all 16-electrode array that is placed according to an average ideal tonotopic layout. Even under the best of circumstances, this placement is a bit of a crapshoot. And that right there is one of the limitations of a cochlear implant. Fortunately, though, there is another way that our ear brains work together to determine pitch, and that's something called temporal coding. Unlike place coding, temporal coding, as the name implies, is all about timing. When a broader group of auditory nerve cells get the signal for a given frequency in phase, such that the front of the sound wave arrives at this group of nerves at the exact same time, your brain pays special attention and says, yep, that's 440 Hertz. In addition to place coding, Advanced Bionics, and others I believe, make use of sophisticated temporal coding schemes to let your cochlea know what frequency is being stimulated. That probably explains, at least partially, why I can discern hundreds of distinct pitches with my cochlear implant, even though I only have 16 electrodes doing the stimulating. The other explanation is something called current steering, which I've talked about in other videos and isn't super important to what I'm trying to explain right now, so we'll skip it. So we have temporal coding and place coding working together to tell your brain that the note you're hearing is A in about the middle of your keyboard, or 440 Hertz. But what if your temporal coding is saying 440 Hz, but the place coding is a little off? Let's say it's being stimulated a tad further toward the outside of your cochlea, maybe because the electrode wasn't inserted deep enough, or probably just because your cochlear anatomy isn't perfectly average. Well, then confusion reigns. At first, everything would sound higher in pitch than you would expect it to be. Many CI recipients claim that the brain adapts to this in time, and I've experienced that myself to a degree. And I kind of think that may be because my brain is starting to reconcile the conflicting messages that it's getting from the place coding and temporal coding algorithms. If you expect a voice based on memory to sound a certain way and your temporal coding agrees, maybe the place coding part of the brain is just getting tired of arguing and says, "Fine, have it your way. I am so over everyone sounding like a minion." In other words, you learn to tune out Minnie Mouse and you end up being okay with it. And this is where my experimental program came in. My audiologist agreed to turn off the two electrodes that stimulate the outer portion of my cochlea, numbers 15 and 16. The theory is that the processor would redistribute all of the frequencies between the remaining 14 active electrodes, which would mean that any given frequency stimulation would occur just a little bit further down in my cochlea, where it might better match the place coding of my tonotopic organization, and with the temporal coding for that frequency. And it worked! Voices and musical instruments on my implant side with my experimental program sound more accurately pitched and agree much better with the hearing aid in my non-implanted ear. There was some weirdness to it, but I lived with it for a while and became quite used to it. It sounded natural. Voices, audiobooks, and even some music sounded so much better. I cracked the code, and I was happy. So, after 10 days on the experimental map, I decided to do my due diligence and go back to my original map for a week. I was fully expecting Minnie Mouse to come roaring back and fully expecting to hate it. Well, Minnie Mouse did come roaring back, but here's the thing. I didn't hate it. It only took just a few minutes for my brain to reacclimate to my original map. It felt like an old familiar friend. The pitch of some voices sounded more normal than I expected, almost like the other map had helped to train my brain or something. But the biggest difference was in the high end. What I hadn't noticed before that was missing from my experimental map was the sizzling clarity of S's and T sounds, and the snap of a snare drum or a closed hi-hat. Birds sounded more natural, and understanding speech was a breeze with my original map. So after a week of that, I once again went back to my experimental map, and this time I paid less attention to the pitch of the voices and instruments and more on that high end. When I'd pick up my car keys, I noticed that they sounded bigger than they actually are, less tinkly and more clangy, more like a set of metal measuring cups than car keys. It didn't take me too long to realize that even though Minnie Mouse was back, I actually preferred the bright, clean, high frequencies that my original map gave me. The high-pitched voice issue didn't bother me nearly as much as I thought that it might, and I had to admit that speech, especially in noisier environments, was easier to understand with my original map than it was with my experimental map. So, after all of that, I guess the experiment was a failure. The win goes to my original map. So, until next time, thank you for watching. No, just kidding. Did you really think I was done? Of course not. No, instead, I got to thinking, what if I could lower the pitch of voices to better match my natural tonotopic organization, like my experimental map seemed to do, but without lowering the pitch of the high frequencies that gave me the clarity of those bright, sizzling S's and T sounds? I started to wonder, are those high frequencies actually even important to my ability to understand pitch? Well, it turns out that they're not. I went back to school and here's what I learned. Our hearing is finely tuned to determine pitch differences in the lower and mid-range frequencies, which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint if you think about it. As a matter of fact, the physics of temporal coding start to break down as frequencies get higher. The higher the frequencies, the closer together the wavefronts get, until it's beyond the ability of the auditory nerve to resolve the difference. The big takeaway from all of this is super important. The higher the frequency is, the worse we humans do at determining pitch. Okay, some more lingo. JND, a technical term that stands for just noticeable difference. I know, I was expecting something more fancy than that, but it just refers to the smallest frequency change that the average person can detect. At lower frequencies, like for instance that 440 Hertz we've been talking about, the JND is only 0.3%. At 440 Hertz, that's just 1 1/3 Hertz. That means the average person can tell the difference between 440 Hertz and 441 1/3 Hertz. That's really not much of a difference. Now, let's jump to the highest note on a standard 88-key keyboard. That's 4,186 Hertz. Actually, it's 4,186.009 Hertz, but who cares? By the time you get up there, the JND, just noticeable difference, jumps up to several percent, and it just gets worse from there. Isn't that cool? Okay, well, I thought it was cool, and here's why. Take a look at this real-time analyzer. This shows the distribution of sound energy across the frequency spectrum. Notice that human speech sits pretty much between 100 and 1,000 Hertz, with the more expressive aspects of music going up to maybe 2,000 Hertz. This sits right in the sweet spot of the human ability to detect pitch changes. But check this out. Sister Susie sat on a thistle. Sibilant sounds like S's and T's are where a lot of speech intelligibility come from. Those frequencies sit roughly between about 4 and 8K, which is also where the snap of a snare drum comes from. Those frequencies, they make the keys in my hand tingle instead of clang. And since they're way up there above 4K, I don't really care if they're exactly the right pitch because, hey, everybody's JND is super forgiving of such inaccuracies up in that range. And it would just seem that my brain loves those sounds. They're what get me excited about slapping my processor on my head in the morning. And that explains why I think I've ended up preferring my original map to my experiment of turning off electrodes 15 and 16, even though voice pitches are much more accurate and natural with them turned off. Take a look. If 15 and 16 are turned off, there's nothing being stimulated up there where the auditory nerve is expecting to hear them. In other words, temporal coding doesn't matter because it doesn't work at those high frequencies, and the place coding is just all wrong because I turned off those electrodes. There's nothing being stimulated up in that place. And that brings me to my next experiment. Do you see where I'm going with all of this? What if instead of turning off 15 and 16, we tried turning off 14 and 15, or maybe 13 and 14, or maybe just 14 or 15? Would that push those lower frequencies down in pitch like my experimental map did, while placing those higher frequencies that I've been missing back up into their appropriate location on the outside of my cochlea, where those sizzling S sounds make my brain so happy? I don't know. Makes sense to me. Will it create other unanticipated issues that make things worse instead of better? Maybe. Probably. But hey, I've got to find out. My next mapping isn't for another 6 weeks, so I'll have plenty of time to mull this over. I've already run this by my wonderful audiologist, who replied pointing out possible issues, but concluded by saying, "Happy to try what you like. You seem to know your ears very well." If you want to see how it all turns out, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that little notification bell icon. That's how you know when I've uploaded another video. You can subscribe, but if you don't hit that, you don't get the message that I've uploaded a new one. Any questions or anything else you'd like me to delve into, just let me know in the comments. In the meantime, I wish you all well, and thanks again for listening.